In August of 2024, Microsoft did something almost nobody noticed. Quietly, with no press conference and no fanfare, the company handed over one of its own software projects, a tool called Mono, to the very people building the technology designed to make Windows irrelevant. They handed it to the developers of Wine. Think about what that means. Microsoft, the company that spent 30 years fighting to keep you locked inside Windows, donated its own code to the open source project whose entire purpose is to let you run your Windows apps without Windows. That was not a mistake. That was not a charity move, and it tells you something important about where this is all heading. Because here is what most people still do not know. There is a tool that has existed for over 30 years. It runs right now on millions of computers. It allows regular people, not programmers, not IT professionals, to open their favorite Windows applications directly on Linux. No virtual machine, no second license, no reinstalling Windows alongside Linux. It is called Wine, and it has just become more powerful than it has ever been in its entire history. I am going to show you exactly what Wine is, how it works, why Microsoft just handed its own software to the people who build it, and what this means for anyone sitting on a Windows machine right now, wondering whether they can actually leave. Stay with me, because the answer is about to get a lot more interesting. Let me give you one number right now, because it changes everything. As of January 2024, approximately 90% of all Steam games are playable on Linux. 90%. That is not a Linux enthusiast boasting on a forum. That is the result of years of community testing tracked by ProtonDB, the largest independent database of Windows software on Linux compatibility reports in the world. According to ProtonDB, at least 15,855 games are rated playable on Linux by verified community reports. And Valve's own Deck-Rated program lists 21,694 titles rated at least playable on SteamOS. Now, you might say, that is games. I do not care about games. I need Microsoft Office. I need the accounting software my business has used for 15 years. Fair. According to recent testing of Wine 1.1, Microsoft Office 2024 mostly works under Wine, with Word and Excel being particularly stable. Visual Studio Code runs nearly flawlessly, and some .NET Framework applications that previously required extensive configuration now work with minimal setup. And here is a detail that matters for anyone with older software. Wine 11 transparently runs 16-bit, 32-bit, and 64-bit Windows applications. That means software from the Windows 95 era, software from the early 2000s. Programs your company may have paid for decades ago and never replaced. Wine can run them. Today on Linux. The reason most people have never heard of this is simple. Wine does not advertise. It does not have a marketing budget. It does not have a COO doing keynotes. It is built by volunteers and a small number of corporate sponsors, and it has been quietly improving since 1993. But the story of how it got to this point and why Microsoft's involvement changes everything is one you need to hear, because it goes a lot deeper than a free software download. To understand what Wine actually is, you first need to understand a common misconception, one that the project's own name was designed to correct. Wine is a compatibility layer capable of running Windows applications on Linux. Instead of simulating internal Windows logic like a virtual machine or emulator, Wine translates Windows API calls into Python calls on the fly, eliminating the performance and memory penalties of other methods and allowing you to cleanly integrate Windows applications into your desktop. The name Wine stands for Wine is not an emulator. That is not a joke. It is a precise technical statement. When you run a virtual machine, your computer is pretending to be an entirely different computer. That takes enormous processing power. Wine does something fundamentally different. When a Windows application asks for a window to be created with specific dimensions, Wine intercepts that call and handles it using Linux's graphics system. When the application wants to load a texture, or access a file, Wine translates that request into something Linux understands. It does not simulate an Intel processor. It does not pretend to be Windows. It just translates the language the software speaks. That is why Wine can be surprisingly fast. There is no emulation overhead eating through your CPU. The translation happens in real time invisibly, and in most cases, the application has no idea it is not running on Windows. Wine began in 1993 under the initial coordination of Bob Amstad, originally as a way to support running Windows 3.1 programs on Linux. Very early on, leadership passed to Alexander Juilliard, who has managed the project ever since. Juilliard has led this project for over 30 years. He is not famous in the way that Linus Torvalds is famous. He does not give TED Talks. But the software he has overseen has quietly become one of the most significant pieces of open-source infrastructure in the history of personal computing. Over those 3 decades, the project attracted corporate support. Code Weavers, a company based in Minnesota, built a commercial product on top of Wine called Crossover. Code Weavers contributes approximately 2/3 of all commits made to the Wine project, contributing their work back to the open-source codebase. Valve, the company behind Steam, built Proton, a gaming-focused compatibility stack based on Wine, and funded its development aggressively after the Steam Deck was announced. And then, in 2024, Microsoft itself entered the picture. But not in the way you might expect. On the 27th of August, 2024, Microsoft announced it was donating the Mono project to the developers of Wine. The announcement came from Microsoft principal software engineer Jeff Schwartz, who stated that the Wine Achicure organization would be taking over as stewards of the Mono project. To understand why this matters, you need to know what Mono is. Mono is an open-source implementation of Microsoft's .NET framework, the underlying technology that powers a vast portion of Windows software written in the last 25 years. Applications built with .NET. Programs written in C-hack software that requires the .NET framework to run. All of them depend on this foundation. And for years, Wine had been maintaining its own internal version of Mono specifically to make those Windows applications run on Linux. Microsoft became the steward of the Mono project when it acquired BindTool in 2016. The last major release of the original Mono project was in July 2019, with only minor patch releases since that time. Microsoft had largely moved on. It had its own modern NetThreum and no particular reason to invest further in the original Mono project, so it handed it to Wine. The August 2024 announcement combined practical necessity with symbolic importance. For Wine's developers, the transfer meant that the source code and the project's future were now officially theirs. It gave Mono an opportunity for compatibility-driven development it had not seen in years. Think about the symbolism there for a moment. Microsoft viewed Linux as a cancer, whose executives once described open-source software as a threat to the American economy, donated its own .NET implementation to the people building the escape hatch from Windows. Whether Microsoft intended it that way or not, the practical effect is the same. Wine just got stronger. The first major release under Wine Achicure stewardship, Mono 6.1 4.0, brought native ARM64 support for macOS and substantial advances in Windows Forms for Linux users, advances that had been stalled for 5 years under Microsoft's ownership. 5 years of improvements unlocked in a single handover. But the real question is, who is actually using this? And what does it feel like to be the person who switched, who walked away from Windows entirely and found out whether Wine kept its promises? The ecosystem around Wine has grown into something far larger than a single project. When Valve released Proton in 2018 and later shipped the Steam Deck, a handheld PC running Linux, it forced the Windows gaming ecosystem to reckon with compatibility in a way it never had before. Valve invested heavily, assigned engineers to Wine-related work, and began submitting patches back to the open-source project. The result was an acceleration that the volunteer community alone could never have achieved. Wine 11, released in January 2026, introduced support for the Linux kernel's NT synchronization primitive N2Sync, which was integrated into the Linux kernel in kernel version 6.14 in March 2025. This addition brings Windows 9 compatible synchronization calls directly into the Linux kernel, improving the performance and accuracy of Windows software running through Wine. That is not a minor tweak. That is the Linux kernel itself being modified to run Windows applications better. Wine 11 also brought full support for the new WOD 64 mode, first introduced as an experimental feature in Wine 9, now considered fully supported, allowing modern 64-bit Wine to run 32-bit Windows applications. That is significant for anyone with older software, legacy programs from the early 2000s, specialty tools that never received updates, niche business applications that their developers abandoned years ago. All of them become candidates. The commercial side has matured as well. Crossover, CodeWeaver's supported product built on Wine, has continued to improve and now includes one-click installation for hundreds of popular Windows applications, which has covered Wine since at least 2002, recommends Crossover as an easier and more compatible alternative for users who find the command line setup too technical. And the numbers on the gaming side keep telling the same story in the 7 years since Proton launched. Linux has gone from offering a handful of indie titles to supporting tens of thousands of playable games. What happened to gaming is now starting to happen to productivity software, to creative tools, and to business applications. The question is no longer whether Linux can run your Windows software. The question is which specific apps you have, and the answer for most people is more encouraging than they expect. But what does it actually cost someone when they try to make this switch and run into the gaps that still exist? That is the story most tutorials skip, and it is one you need to hear. When people talk about running Windows apps on Linux with Wine, they usually talk about success stories. They show tin tones. They post benchmark results. What they do not often talk about is the moment of reckoning, the specific application that matters most to a specific person, and whether Wine can handle it. Consider what this looks like for a retired engineer in his late 60s. He bought AutoCAD in 2007. He has a perpetual license. He knows every menu, every shortcut, every quirk of that specific version. He has no interest in subscribing to AutoCAD's modern cloud model, where Autosk charges over $2,000 a year for access to software he once paid for outright. He wants to stay on Linux because he is tired of Windows 11 rearranging his desktop, collecting his data, and pushing advertisements into his start menu. But his work depends on that software. This is the real tension. Wine was built to resolve, not for gamers, but for people like him, people who have invested years, sometimes decades, in specific tools. People who feel, correctly, that the company that sold them those tools has changed the terms of the relationship without their consent. Wine works best for productivity applications that are self-contained and relatively simple. Apps run through Wine appear in desktop windows just like native Linux applications. That is by design. The goal was never to make Linux feel like a Windows replacement that you had to think about. The goal was to make the transition invisible where possible. The honest answer for the retired engineer is that older, standalone, perpetual license versions of software often work better in Wine than modern subscription-based replacements. Older AutoCAD versions, older versions of Office, these are frequently tested and frequently rated gold or platinum in Wine's community database. They were built before software companies decided that the internet should be between you and your own tools at all times. Back in the mid-90s and early 2000s, Linux suffered from a severe lack of useful applications. This was especially critical in the business world, where Windows desktop applications could make or break whether Linux was viable at all. Wine was the answer to that problem. 30 years later, the problem has changed. Linux now has excellent native alternatives for most software categories, but the irreplaceable tools, the ones tied to specific wikwiks, specific licenses, specific years of muscle memory, those still need a bridge. and wine is still that bridge? The people who switched and made it work are not computer scientists. They are accountants who preferred QuickBooks 2018 version. They are writers who spent 15 years learning Microsoft Word's quirks. They are small business owners who bought a piece of industry software in 2012 and cannot afford to replace it. Wine is the reason their switch to Linux became possible rather than theoretical. It would be dishonest to end the story there, because wine is not a perfect solution, and the people watching this deserve a straight account of what it is and what it is not. The optimistic case is strong. Wine has 30+ years of development behind it. It has backing from Valve, from code weavers, and now, indirectly, from Microsoft's own code donation. It has an annual release cycle, a massive community database, and a commercial product that makes the experience significantly more approachable. For a large category of Windows software, particularly older, standalone applications, it works remarkably well for gaming. The numbers speak for themselves. The realistic case is more nuanced. Wine does not run everything. Applications that rely heavily on Microsoft's latest cloud services, applications tied to kernel-level components, and software with aggressive digital rights management built in are still problematic. Wine does not support installation from the Microsoft Store. That rules out applications distributed exclusively through Microsoft's modern ecosystem. And while the setup process has improved substantially, it still requires more patience than installing an application on Windows. You may need to install additional components. You may need to configure a Wine prefix, essentially a virtual Windows environment, separately for different applications. The commercial crossover product simplifies much of this, but it costs money, around $74 per year at last check. For many users, that is entirely reasonable. For others, the free version of Wine, with some time invested in configuration, achieves the same results. There is also a philosophical point worth making clearly. Wine is not the final destination. It is a bridge. The goal, for most people who care about this technology, is not to run Windows apps on Linux forever. It is to run them long enough to find native Linux alternatives, build new freakings, and eventually not need the bridge anymore. Wine buys you time. It lowers the cost of leaving Windows. It means you do not have to choose between your operating system and your tools on day one. For the audience watching this channel, people who feel Microsoft has broken their trust, who are curious about Linux but worried about losing access to the software they rely on. Wine is the most important tool in that transition, not because it solves every problem, because it gives you enough runway to figure out which problems actually need solving. Think back to where we started. August 2024. Microsoft quietly, with no press event and no acknowledgement of what it symbolized, handed the keys of its net implementation to the people building the exit door from Windows. That was not charity. That was a company that had moved on, offloading a tool it no longer needed, to a community that still did. But the effect is the same either way. Wine is more capable today than it has ever been in 32 years of development. The Linux kernel itself has been modified to run Windows software better, and tens of thousands of Windows applications, from legacy tools to modern productivity software, are working on Linux right now without a virtual machine, without a Windows license, without Microsoft's permission. You asked whether you could leave. The answer is, more people are leaving than you think, and Wine is a significant reason why. If this raised a question you want answered next specifically, which Windows apps work in Wine and which do not, and how to actually set it up without spending an afternoon reading documentation, that is exactly what the next video covers. It is a practical Corkloads, built for people who have never used Linux before, using real software, with real results, no assumptions, no jargon, just the process, from start to finish. If that is the kind of content you came here for, honest, verified, built for people who are done being told what to think about their own computers, then subscribing is how you make sure you see it when it arrives. Not because we need the number, because the next video is where this story gets personal.